Many gamers out there are aware of the Elder Scrolls franchise, a series of fantasy role-playing games dating back to 1994. Throughout its 30-year lifespan, the series has produced many iconic titles such as Skyrim, Oblivion, Morrowind, Daggerfall, and Arena. Most fans of the franchise are only aware of those 5 mainline titles, when in actuality, there exist many more entries in the series. Released in between those massive titles were smaller spin-off games, available on a wide variety of platforms, all set in the same universe but with vastly different styles of gameplay. As of now, there exists 10 Elder Scrolls spin-off titles, most of which are rather obscure and not viewed in the most positive light. This is for a variety of reasons that we'll get into, but the point is people rarely play or discuss these games, and I wanted to know why. So I decided I will not only become the first person to play all 10, but the first to beat all 10, no matter how long it took. Now, I want to make it clear I'm no Elder Scrolls lore expert, and I haven't even beaten or played every mainline game. I'm just a large fan of the series who wants to shed some light on these under-discussed and fascinating pieces of gaming history. So, if that interests you, I welcome you to join me as I go over my 100+ hour journey beating all 10 Elder Scrolls spin-off games. A journey full of extreme difficulty, constant frustration, as well as some occasional fun. Let's do it. Released 1 year after the second mainline title Daggerfall, came the series' first spin-off, that being 1997's Battlespire, aka an Elder Scrolls Legend Battlespire. The Legend subtitle was added to let fans of the series know this is going to be a different experience from the norm. See, Battlespire is not your traditional open-world Elder Scrolls role-playing experience. This is instead a very linear game based solely around dungeon crawling. This choice was made because, according to Bethesda's president, fans were asking for a shorter, more detailed, narrower genre hybrid experience, and their answer was to take the dungeons from Daggerfall and base a whole game around it, essentially. This makes a ton of sense upon finding out that Battlespire was originally intended as DLC for Daggerfall. When released, Battlespire was only available to play one way, on one of these bad boys, DOS PCs. Luckily for me, the game can be played through Steam, so no need to invest in a pricey physical copy and a working DOS dinosaur. Going into this first title, I decided I was only going to beat the game's main story, knowing most games in the series typically have a large amount of side quests. For Battlespire, that actually isn't the case, as there's no side quest and only 7 main missions. Which sounds pretty easy, right? You have no idea. When I first launched Battlespire, I was first shown this very of its time but nonetheless charming CGI cutscene going over the story. Despite this game being a little before my time, I have a real soft spot for this era of animation. For the story, it can be simplified as you, the player, have to make your way through this giant floating mage training ground called the Battlespire, with the goal of eventually defeating this guy named Mehrunes Dagon. Once that cutscene concluded, it was time to begin the classic Elder Scrolls character creation process, which this time includes some nudity. Now, I had no clue what I was doing. I figured I should look into a recommended pre-built class, but instead I just went as a Dark Elf Archer with pre-existing stats, figuring it probably wouldn't impact much. When plopped into the game, I was immediately greeted by the insane jank that is Battlespire's combat system. After failing to kill that little scamp, I decided to instead just explore the area and enter the central portal, which resulted immediately in death, followed by a complete game restart, which happens every time you die here, by the way. After recreating my character and actually equipping my gear and saving my game this time, I was ready to attempt combat once more. With the sword in hand, I discovered physically swinging my mouse was how I was meant to fight. That doesn't mean every swing lands though, as hit points are dealt more here like a dice roll depending on your stats. Add to that the fact your weapon can be knocked out of your hands. Saying this was a frustrating start would be an understatement. I then figured it's time to actually start the level's objective, which was to close these 5 glowing gates. I only knew to do this by looking it up, as the game tells you nothing. I mean, there are these help screens and context scrolls at the start of each level that loosely inform you on the objective, but trust me, they're no instructions. As I continued to try out weapons, test out spells, and attempt to use those sigil items in the teleporter once more, I realized this is going to be a brutal playthrough, isn't it? After several more awkward combat interactions, I finally managed to find gate number 2, only to then immediately die again. Shortly after respawning, I stumbled into one of these, a wooden cog. I then proceeded to leave it, not knowing that was also needed to complete the level. I instead continued searching for more gates to close by checking every available door, each of which held behind it many enemies to defeat, some of which had some notable loot. Whenever I would find better armor, I would switch it out using this clunky but charming inventory system. The unfair deaths would continue, but by using the game's quick saves and the helpful map, I was able to make some progress through the level. I then tried using the game's dialogue mechanic, where you can choose to speak with enemies if you want for information or to just skip the fight entirely. The fact you can do that with nearly every enemy in the game is a really neat idea. I just found it a waste of time for the most part. I always did get a kick out of the 90s 2D sprites though. In order to actually make some headway on the mission's objectives, I was trying out all sorts of different weapon types, but none of them seemed to work for me. It was death after death after death. The combat was just insufferable. It was at this point when I decided I'm just going to swerve all enemies and focus on closing these damn gates. And also backtrack for those cogs, because the UESP told me I need those. Now in possession of the cogs, it was time for the first puzzle. The puzzle ended up taking no time at all and only served to introduce the jumping mechanic, which is accomplished via this floating cone you extrude. While exploring this new area, I was having constant inventory problems caused by me literally picking up every sigil I found. One of the biggest complaints people have for Battlespire is the fact you need so many keys to get around the map. These are called sigils of entry, which are literally identical to the normal sigils. At the time, I knew the sigils had some use, but not sure what, so I was just grabbing all of them. A full inventory was the least of my problems, as I couldn't even hold on to my weapon. Nearly every combat interaction resulted in my sword getting knocked out of my hands, which, as you can imagine, is extremely annoying. On top of that, I could just not figure out where to go. Slowly but surely, I would find more of those cogs spread throughout the map, but man did it take some patience. Once I accepted that I'll be dying every couple seconds, I did end up making some progress and closed some more of those gates. Using that previously mentioned jump cone, I found myself doing some platforming. The thing is though, if you don't quite make the jump, you're stuck. For good, requiring a restart. Getting stuck is a constant hurdle in Battlespire. Every time it happens, you just wonder, how did this obvious glitch make it to the final release? How? After speaking with a few characters, interacting with parts of the map, and consulting the UESP once more, I then finally have a grasp on what's left to do for the mission. Mission 1, mind you. I needed to take this lift, kill this guy, use this teleporter, find more gates, find more cogs. The point is, it's a long and confusing mission. Even after 4.5 hours spent, I was still missing cogs. Turns out the devs decided to hide a few of them on seemingly random scamps scattered throughout the map. With now all the gates closed and finally all cogs collected, I was able to enter through the final door. Before that, I had to check out the hidden Mock Turtle character found via this teleporter. After taking in the room's soothing liminal vibes, I then proceeded to level 2. Before that began, I was greeted with the opportunity to further upgrade my character using the points I just earned. Like I did in the beginning, I placed the points without giving it much thought, thinking this probably won't be that important. Newsflash, it is important. The whole stats component is insanely important. Immediately upon starting level 2, this became obvious. Using the same armor, weapons, and fighting methods from before didn't allow me to kill anything here, not even close. After giving level 2 a solid 20 minutes, reality hit me. I gotta redo my stats, aka I gotta redo the game. This time, I wasn't playing around. I was gonna build the most overpowered character possible. Once back in the beginning stats selection screen, I decided I'd go with the popular hand-to-hand build. I won't bore you with the details, but this OP build is centered around high health, aka wounds, high health regen via spell absorption, and only using your hands. Believe it or not, punching is the most effective and easiest to level up weapon in the game. Some character stats and actions serve zero purpose, so lowering those allows you to crank up the actual usable stats. Long story short, this build was 100% the way to go. When back on level 1, I was flying through enemies. We're talking night and day difference in terms of difficulty. Punching your enemies is not only very easy and quick to level up, but it doesn't have a durability to maintain, it can't get knocked out of your hands, and on top of all that, I don't have to be chugging potions constantly because that spell absorption trait allows me to gain health anytime I'm hit with magic, which is non-stop here. Those two strategies combined with my beefy health, which increases every level, combined with me already knowing the gate and cog locations, I made quick work of level 1 and found myself already back on level 2. When faced against the unkillable enemies for now a second time, I was able to take them out no problem. Since I was now exclusively using my fists, I was able to take advantage of this strange mechanic where if an enemy is shoved into a wall, they take additional damage. This combined with the enemies often killing themselves with spells made for a pretty easy mission overall. Things did get tricky when I was faced with a riddle to solve, but luckily I stumbled into a scroll that gave me the answer, along with answers to future riddles. After solving all the various puzzles, doing some more platforming, finding all the needed items, and taking part in some strange conversations, I made my way to the second half of the level. Now that I was actually able to kill enemies, the game became a lot less frustrating. With my fists out, I would go room to room, spamming every foe I encountered, and then I would search their inventory basket only for new entry sigils because weapons had no use to me anymore. I eventually did kill all the enemies on the map, but I was confused on how to complete the objective. Only after looking it up did I discover you have to trigger this trap, grab this item, trigger another trap, grab another item, pray to God the elevator works, then trigger another trapdoor, then grab this mace, read the scroll for a secret word, and then exchange the mace and that word for another item, blah blah blah. It's complicated and it took me a while. These puzzles might seem easy, but they require you to endlessly click around in hopes some animation gets triggered. After completing all the cryptic tasks, I was finally able to progress to level 3. Upon entering the Soul Cairn, I was introduced to many new enemies, some of which were quite glitchy, while others were seemingly unkillable. Using the helpful map, I discovered now was when I'd have to start swimming. That sounds like a fun and cool gameplay switch up until you realize you purposely tanked your endurance stats, meaning you can barely hold your breath underwater. Thankfully, I remembered I had some potions of water breathing on me, so I chugged those and carried on. Disregarding those unkillable wraiths, this level wasn't that bad. Sure, the riddles were hard, the sigils were hard to find, and the ladders were hard to climb, but it was really only those ghostly skeletons who were an issue. Luckily, after taking this liminal boat ride in an underground cave, I came across this scroll that once you read it out loud, it thankfully banishes all wraiths. The rest of the level just has you speaking to more floating gems and finding more wooden poles, which are then used for the end portal. At this point, level 4, I don't know if I'd say I was enjoying the game, but I definitely wasn't hating it like before. Battlespire's immense charm and the fact I can actually compete in combat made for a somewhat tolerable experience. The confusing objectives and the puzzles, those are the real bitch. Finding just the right sigil of entry, or tracking down a well-hidden switch, or my god, deciphering the goddamn puzzles, that's when Battlespire is at its worst. Add to that invisible enemies falling through the map, non-existent stealth, and the fact I can't actually use Daedric armor because of my stats, oh boy, it's rough. Oh, and if you plan on playing this yourself, you better get used to this noise, as you'll be hearing it the entire playthrough. Going back to that previously seen puzzle involving the Daedric letters, just accept the fact you'll need a guide. There's no possible way I would have solved that organically, especially with the enemies present. The only way I was even able to pass that part was by abusing the jump cone for a speed boost. After spending an hour more lost on how to finish the level, I finally found the exit, only to then get stuck on it. Luckily for me, a nearby enemy was able to knock me loose with a hit, allowing me to chat with this fine lady, complete this jank-ass jumping section, and enter the final portal. Surprisingly, upon entering level 5, you're greeted with an open world. Don't get too excited as the viewing distance couldn't be worse, but I'll take what I can get. The goal this time around is to find 14 different items. Yeah. I won't go into depth of what they are and why they're needed, but the point is, it's a tall ask. Finding these items is done by entering the various buildings scattered around the island, some of which have pretty interesting and atmospheric designs. Thank God for the new cone exploit because traversing this area takes a while. At this point, my hand-to-hand skill maxed out, so there was really no point to be killing any enemies anymore, especially since there was 180 of them on the island. Man, if it wasn't for spell absorption, this whole level would be torture. One part of the objective had me using a hot air balloon, which at first I was excited to use until I discovered its laughably low speed. There were several moments throughout this level in particular where I genuinely enjoyed what I was playing. But the game's unrelenting difficulty and overly buggy nature tainted the whole experience. Like, there's this glitch on this specific level where if you save too often, your save files will be corrupted permanently. Try having fun with that looming over your shoulder. Luckily, I never dealt with that problem and eventually gathered all the keys, pieces of armor, and a weapon, allowing me to enter Battlespire's second to last mission. Like always, the enemies were no problem. I made quick work of all the ones present in the beginning area. What was a problem was figuring out the mission objective. What do I do? Where do I go? What narratively is going on? I was so confused. Even though 99.9% of the game's trees do nothing, this one in particular is meant to be interacted with to open the door. Go figure. That's how it goes for a lot of level 6. Non-stop trial and error. Test this sigil, search this useless room, investigate this dead-end portal, attempt to kill this scamp that only this time has infinite health. But if you do manage to get past all that frustrating BS, you do get some of those cozy Elder Scrolls vibes here, especially with some of the interior designs. I know these older titles are not meant to be as spoon-fed as games are today, and I respect that, but wow, does it make for a stressful and time-consuming playthrough. If it wasn't for that map that shows you where you've already been, I'd still be playing Battlespire to this day. After finally tracking down every required character and guessing my way through the extensive dialogue, it was finally time for the final level. It's only fitting this mission finds you in hell because that's what it feels like playing it. Level 7 essentially has you going around this giant circular path with the end goal of facing Mehrunes for the final battle. Now this path you have to take is very linear and surrounded by lava, and most of the time you have to fight enemies using knockback spells. Combine that with the return of wraiths and the addition of these guys who do damage in the form of health drain spells, it's a goddamn nightmare. That kind of attack is like the one thing I could never survive. I can't imagine someone playing this level without abusing all the various cheese strategies I developed. I mean, it truly was a cancerous experience. By just plowing ahead and ignoring everyone, as well as completing a few more cryptic objectives like this chaotic as hell fight for the final sigil, I finally found myself in position for the endgame boss battle. Well, turns out you need to be wearing the armor that you found several missions ago, which I didn't even have on me anymore. I thought, I'm screwed. I mean, I'm not gonna redo half the game. But in classic Battlespire fashion, if you happen to talk to this Wraith, in particular and only this one, he would give you the missing pieces of armor. After that, it was a single hit final fight and bam, Battlespire beaten. Once the final cutscene concluded, the game then completely shut down. Do I recommend playing Battlespire? Hell no. It's stupidly difficult and incredibly glitchy. Yes, there are some good qualities, yes, there are some good Elder Scrolls vibes throughout, but wow, do the cons outweigh the pros. Only after my playthrough did I realize I could have purchased a Battlespire game guide, but good luck finding a copy as it's extremely rare. To make your experience somewhat enjoyable, I'd recommend looking into the multiplayer for this game, which not only allows you and some friends to complete the story together, but also to face off against one another in various different modes. I was beyond blown away finding out that was a thing, and I honestly wish I took advantage of it. When it's all said and done, I spent 17 hours on Battlespire, and we're just getting started. Instead of going under the Legends subtitle, our next spin-off game, 1998's Redguard, exists under the Elder Scrolls Adventures title. That is because, similar to Battlespire, Redguard provides an experience unlike a traditional Elder Scrolls game. There's no role-playing customization, there's no first-person view, and the story present is very distant from the fantasy you're familiar with. It is instead more themed around action and adventure with a strong emphasis on pirates. Except for a few character designs and lore nods, Redguard barely feels like an Elder Scrolls game. Without that added title, this game would likely be forgotten alongside many similar games from the 90s. That's not to say this is a bad game, like Battlespire. Redguard is leagues ahead in many ways, but still no masterpiece. Today, Redguard is mostly known for nearly bankrupting Bethesda while they were working on Morrowind. I've always known it as the other DOS spin-off game that no one ever plays or discusses. I do happen to own the game physically, but my copy is sealed, so we're instead going to be checking out the Steam version. For the story in Redguard, it solely focuses on the character Cyrus, a Redguard mercenary who's searching for his missing sister on the island of Stormhold. There's a lot more to the plot, but just know this is not your average expansive Elder Scrolls storyline. It's a lot smaller and focuses on fewer characters. Here in Redguard, there are again no side quests, some optional objectives, but no non-essential quests. The story also isn't split into separate levels like before. This time it's more one big narrative that has 3 completion branches that loosely can be chopped into 11 sections. Upon starting a new game, you're played another charming CGI cutscene, complete with nods to future Elder Scrolls titles like Morrowind, Oblivion, and everyone's favorite, Elder Scrolls Romanelli. Throughout the game, you're played many cutscenes like this, which all look surprisingly good for the time and were really a joy to watch. What isn't so enjoyable is the game's combat system, which you're expected to figure out right away. When discussing Redguard Online, the combat is always what's brought up most, as it is probably the worst aspect of the game. Damage is dealt in a similar dice rolly way like Battlespire, and it's impossible to determine the proper fighting distance and how and if you're even affecting the enemy's health. I'm just saying it now, I avoided fighting altogether in Redguard. A lot of times it isn't necessary and I could just never get the feel for it down, so I gave up trying almost immediately. Redguard is also exclusively played on your keyboard, which, as you can guess, makes for a jank control scheme. Again, this comes from a generation of video games where you're just supposed to figure out everything yourself. Redguard's lack of instruction is a large reason people never get far in the game. I wasn't even a slight bit surprised when I saw how big the game guide was for this. It's like the devs knew we were going to need a ton of help with this confusing ass game, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. One thing I gotta compliment Redguard for is its world. No more linear hallways. Redguard, for the most part, is an open world. The building designs, the character models, the overall atmosphere is great. Distant from Elder Scrolls, but still great. Once I got accustomed with the beautiful town of Stormhold, I figured it's time to start the main quest. Right away, one thing you'll notice with Redguard is how dialogue heavy it is. Every character has a lot to say, and you better pay attention as a lot of what they say matters. I'll explain this more in detail, but turning on subtitles and really listening to what everyone has to say ends up being crucial. Another thing you'll learn right away is you should save your game constantly. Unexpected deaths and game crashes are a non-stop occurrence, so saving often is a smart idea. Thankfully, the game doesn't completely quit out this time and instead just spawns you back on your last save whenever you die. Following what I was told at the bar, I visited the town priest not only to continue my quest, but for him to heal my candlestick health bar. My next task was to find a missing character by searching a nearby park. Finding the park was no problem, but for the life of me, I could not figure out what to do next. Apparently, I was supposed to end up underneath this waterfall, which I never would have figured out unless I looked it up. Heads up, I will be doing that a lot for this playthrough because wow, Redguard does not explain a damn thing. Like when in this cave, I had no clue where to go. Turns out you're supposed to fall off this bridge and bounce on multiple mushrooms. I would have never thought to do that. Also, keep in mind, I'm a very impatient gamer, so bear with me. Redguard overall is a massive patience tester. The tediousness of nearly every mechanic in the game is enough to drive you mad. Item grabbing, potion drinking, or just walking is all at a pace just slow enough to cause frustration. Nothing is more frustrating here than the platforming. My god, the footage speaks for itself. This cave portion of the story was very difficult, mainly for how much of that platform jumping there was. Especially this particular mushroom jump. It took me 30 minutes of trial and error to land. Near the end, you're tasked with performing this well-timed jump onto this moving fish, and oh boy, did I struggle with that too. Something you'll have to get extremely used to is the temporary speed boost you receive after respawning. It's so incredibly annoying and makes the platforming areas that much harder. Similar to Battlespire, just accept you'll need a guide. There's no shame in it. Remember, the devs thought so too. Oh, and did I mention that loud looping music that you hear incessantly? Can't turn that off. That's actually a glitch exclusive to the Steam version. Okay, with that portion finally done, it was time to move on. After asking around the town and following some helpful road signs, I managed to get to this actually kind of fun puzzle involving a disintegrating bridge. Once crossed, I convinced this sick-looking boat captain to take me to the Isle of Nagasta. This part of the map was a big highlight for me. I loved the entire design. It's just brimming with atmosphere. Plus, it features my favorite character, the titular island owner, Nagasta, in all his worm-like glory. To move on, you take the amulet he gives you to the governor's palace, where, after watching a cutscene, you're imprisoned and need to escape. This portion of the story, for the most part, is solid. If you can get past the disastrous combat, fun can be had. Using the 3 potions I was constantly picking up, I was able to somewhat compete against the guards. In order to progress through this particular area, you have to complete multiple puzzles and various obstacle courses. Some are tricky, but doable if you save after every jump like I did. Others, like this rune puzzle, that's a look it up situation. Some of the puzzles in Redguard strike that good level of difficulty, but others require genius level intellect, as you'll see. It was at this point in the game when I had had enough with the guards. It didn't matter if you were mid-conversation, they'd be non-stop on your ass. After eventually shaking them off, I was able to go and search for the next quest. Before I started one, I wanted to purchase the game's few merchant items. In Redguard, you can't sell anything, but you can buy a few things using gold. The game has a 500 gold carrying cap, which you'll be hitting quite often. The good thing is you won't be buying much, just a few quest items and some pricey healing potions, which in classic Redguard style, you have to buy one by one. The format for most missions would just have you find a specific character and either retrieve an item for them or just do what they say. Like I said earlier, you have to pay attention, no matter how hard the accent is to decipher. Some objectives sound easy on paper, but are actually quite complicated. Like here, for example, you have to find an eyepiece, exchange it for a flag, then use the flag to alert a bell tower, which then gets a guy out of his house, allowing you to grab an item from his house, all while your game crashes incessantly. I'm not joking when I say Redguard crashed probably about every 15 minutes. If you're able to put up with that, decent gameplay can be experienced, but you'll be fighting off the urge to give up every time you see this screen in particular. At this point, roughly halfway through the game, the guards were getting to me even more. It is a bit of a me problem since I decided against killing them, but wow, do they nearly ruin the game. Jesus Christ, they're shouting. It's non-stop.
Put it down. A sharp put. Surrender now. I'll spill yours yet. Surrender now.
The next portion of the game, which took place in some dwarven ruins, I was a big fan of. Visually, at least. The old school dwarven vibes here are really a joy to take in. When it comes to the platforming, it's clunky, but I'm getting used to it. The combat, I'm learning to hate it less. The puzzles? Zooey mama. Several of the mission's objectives were tricky, but solvable. But this giant transforming scarab puzzle, it might be one of the most complicated in any game I've ever played. Even with the help of the UESP, I was blown away at what's expected of the player. Not only is determining the correct orientation very tricky, but actually physically triggering the scarab's mechanisms is no easy feat. Immediately following that is another puzzle of equal difficulty involving some rotating pipes. The initial rotations I made with no problem, but forcing the lava through, I had no clue. Turns out this hard to find and glitchy wheel needs to be turned, combined with the correct orientation of the pipes, and then you can trigger the cutscene. Again, maybe it's the gaming era I grew up in, the spoon-fed generation, but man, I would not have been able to figure that out without some help. After doing some backtracking, I was faced with the game's second boss fight. The first one I just skipped out of laziness. This one was required, so I gave it a shot. Once I spawned back in, I assumed there had to be some unique and overly complicated way to take this guy out, but nope. Just spam your sword and that'll do the trick. It was at this point when I wanted to get my hands on a map. Naturally, I went to the cartographer, but nope. You actually have to get it off of a pirate's dead body. This was easier said than done, as this was an especially glitchy pirate. Once I finally received one, it was time to use the nearby lighthouse. Stupidly, I didn't know you had to light the lighthouse, so I wasted a lot of time initially, but eventually got it lit and attempted the proper signal. The intended Morse code pattern is supposed to be deciphered from this.
What? Why scares me now? Some ancient dwarven observatory. Slash.
I would have never thought to make that connection without the internet telling me prior. After an embarrassing amount of attempts, I was able to successfully flash the signal and cue the next section. My confusion continued as I was handed this seemingly useless bandage item. Well, if I paid more attention to the dialogue, I'd know I'd have to wear it, which then applies blood to it, which then allows you to open a book. Rip the gamers in the 90s who had to figure this shit out naturally. I would have buckled and bought the phone book sized guide. Like, take for example this next section, where I had to place these two starstones in the correct astrological position. What's required is you go to this dwarven observatory across the map, fix the telescope using the gear you acquired hours earlier, then adjust its height to a very specific setting, then lift yourself up in each position until you eventually find where the serpent is. Then you head back to the camp and place the stones accordingly in the circle diagram. Oh, and throw in some crashes and guard interruptions for good measure. Maybe it's just me, but damn, that's asking a lot of the player to put that all together. One thing is for certain, locations like that dwarven observatory look so damn cool, they almost make the whole experience worth it. A nice gameplay switch up occurs with the next section when you're turned into what the game calls a gremlin. For how much Redguard pisses me off, this won me over a bit. It wouldn't be long until another tricky puzzle reared its ugly face, this time involving the gremlin speaking the phrase, "change me back." Considering what I've been through, this wasn't all that bad. Extreme patience was needed for the remainder of the mission, as that post-save speed boost made things really difficult. To discuss something I really did like was this treasure hunt objective, where by using multiple map segments, you're able to track down a hidden quest item. After testing the required amount of paces several times, I finally unearthed the treasure, only to then be rewarded with this. Crash aside, this portion was a big highlight for me, even if I had to hit up our friends over at the you-know-who. With that newly acquired flask in hand, it was time to revisit my old buddy Nagasta for a series of confusing objectives, starting with pouring a potion in a hole to cause an explosion. An explosion you're actually supposed to be hit by just at the right time to boost you up to a stairwell. To be honest, probably never would have figured that out. Then I was faced with the Slime Lord himself, where in order to defeat him, I had to use that flask to reflect his magic back at him. Surprisingly enough, this is the only time you wield magic in the game. Following that is another puzzle, maybe the game's hardest. It requires you to decipher this book of recipes written in riddles in order to brew up just the right potion in order to open up a portal. Luckily for me, I have an internet connection, so it wasn't that bad. What came next was truly unexpected.
Wow, I'm so glad it could come!
This is the kind of shit I play these games for. Goofy deep cut characters like these. After solving that area's logic puzzle and watching another cutscene, it was time to return to the catacombs to continue the story. The thing is though, the game was getting glitchy. Glitchier than normal. NPCs were invisible, and I couldn't enter anything, including the catacombs. So I reloaded my game and tried again, and the load bar stopped at 95%. Right away, I recognized this as Redguard's infamous 95% load glitch. A glitch where the only way to enter that specific building is by tweaking the game files. The recommended fix is to find a save file with that location loaded, grab the corresponding TSG file, and replace it with the one in your current save. I tried that, but it didn't work. I then thought maybe if I spawned in the main quest item, it would allow me to carry on the mission. I did manage to spawn it, but that also did not work. I then started panicking as the potential of me having to redo the whole game was becoming more and more likely. I was 14.5 hours into the game at that point, so that was a no can do. I had to find a way to fix this glitch. I tried using commands to spawn me into the catacombs, that didn't work. I was able to spawn in by starting a new game, but no file would appear. A file was available when I spawned in the catacombs exit with the gem in hand, but when placed in the correct folder, the game would then be unplayable. At this point, my frustration levels were at an all-time high, but I was not ready to restart just yet. I instead decided to search deep online for hopefully someone who uploaded some usable save files. By some miracle, I was able to find some from 2005 that were conveniently labeled like checkpoints. Sadly, these didn't work either, as they also led to a crash. I then thought maybe that's because these files were for the GOG version. So I searched that up, purchased it for 60% off, added the save files, and finally I was able to pick back up where I left off, right inside the catacomb doors. And lucky for me, the previous player had a loaded inventory, and I was finally able to disable that goddamn music. Bless up for that. Honestly, from that point on, the game was pretty smooth sailing. For the most part, the puzzles were on the easier side. This brick one did take some effort, but not nearly as much as past examples. This mission was filled with standout sequences and memorable moments, none more than this awkward as hell fight against a dragon. A dragon that only takes damage if you dip your sword in the flames before you attack it. The Redguard devs were really on some different shit, because who would have thought to do that? Before starting the game's final mission, guess what? I ran into another glitch, this time involving the character Saban, who would not stop walking away. After trying out all the various solutions online, none of which worked, I thought maybe I should try another one of those 2005 save games. That save had the same exact glitch, so I thought let me just skip one more checkpoint ahead and I'll watch the missing cutscene on YouTube. Finally, after all of that, I made it, Redguard's final mission. As you would expect, my time in the Governor's Palace was filled with classic Redguard bullshit. I was essentially speedrunning this level as I no longer cared about anything besides completing the objective and reaching the end of this disastrous game. It's only fitting that the final showdown against Richten was a buggy mess. 20 health potions and a shitload of saves later, I was finally able to trigger the end cutscene, therefore ending my playthrough of the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard. I'm so conflicted with the spinoff, even more than with Battlespire. There's a lot to love, especially when it comes to those cozy old school Elder Scrolls vibes, and the story too, it's actually quite good. There's actually a prequel comic book out there, complete with a figure, for those fans looking for more juicy Redguard lore. But when looking back at all the impossible puzzles and the absolutely bonkers amount of glitches, many of which are game-breaking, it has me more leaning towards not recommending it. Oh, and if you're curious, Redguard took me 18 hours to beat. 18 hours. Hopefully this next title will bring us more into the modern age of Elder Scrolls and leave all these clunky controls and dated visuals in the past. As you can see, that isn't the case, as the third spin-off released in the Elder Scrolls series was a mobile title. Mobile as in these sort of phones, the flip open and keyboard type. This game, Stormhold, and the one following it, Dawnstar, released under a new series name, The Elder Scrolls Travels. These two games did release a year apart from one another, but are very similar, so I'll begin with discussing them together and then break them down individually. The Travels subtitle is literally only in reference to the fact every game under that name is a portable title. Stormhold and Dawnstar are actually the first spin-off games not to be developed by Bethesda. Instead, this time it's Virtual Studios, who is a sister company to Bethesda Softworks and a subsidiary of ZeniMax. Now, these two games might be familiar to you if you played the Morrowind expansion Blood Moon, as they were released right after that and advertised within that game's installation process. The first release was Stormhold in 2003, followed by Dawnstar in 2004. These two games are unique in many ways. Not only do they visually stand out, but they differ with how many versions of them exist. What I mean is, depending on which phone you're playing these games on, the content amount would vary. If playing on an advanced phone, you'd have access to 36 dungeons and an exclusive class. If playing on the least advanced version, you'd only have access to 8 dungeons, but access to an exclusive minigame. If that wasn't complicated enough, you also had to have the right phone carrier to even be able to get the apps. Even though both games contain 36 dungeons, each of which are randomly generated, there aren't 36 missions to beat each. Instead, Stormhold and Dawnstar have one main objective that you work at by entering up to possibly 36 dungeons. Oh, and again, there are no side quests here, just to be clear. For my playthroughs, I'm playing the largest version of each in the Java phone emulator K-Emulator. It's not important, but worth mentioning how I played these games out of order, so we're going to be starting with Dawnstar. For the story/objective present here, you have to make your way through the icy city of Dawnstar with the goal of tracking down 4 champions, one of which is a traitor. Along your way, you find gift items which can be given to the champions in exchange for clues that help you determine who the traitor is. Once the correct champion is accused, you will then have to defend the city against the final boss, the Geheneth Thriceborn. Now, I know what you're thinking, this game looks like unplayable garbage. But you have to remember what device we're on here. When you really think about it, it's rather advanced. Upon starting my playthrough, I thought it'd be smart to read through the help screen and do a little initial research on the different classes in order to not find myself in another Battlespire situation. The Rogue class looked good to me, so I chose that, and bam, I was ready to play Elder Scrolls on a flip phone. My first thought was, wow, this is going to be a nightmare to control, isn't it? For my game, I used the number pad as it somewhat replicated a phone keyboard, but it still took a ton of getting used to. While getting accustomed to the game, I noticed a few things right off the bat. First being, the game is completely silent, at least on emulator. Second, there's only one save slot, so you have to make sure not to overwrite it or save yourself in a deadly dead end. Third, you have to play with tank controls, and fourth, it looks like you can skip right to the final fight with the Geheneth, but that would be pointless at such a low level. In order to achieve that first-person point of view, the game attempts this pseudo 3D look when going through the hallways. If not obvious, this makes navigation nearly impossible. By almost exclusively using the minimap and expanded map, it is possible to know where you're going, but trust me, it's an acquired skill. The game starts you in this camp safe area that contains multiple NPCs able to sell you weapons, armor, and magic items, as well as Eustasia, who can perform a variety of tasks including healing you and giving you rumors about the champions, which are also needed to reveal the traitor. To begin my dungeon crawling, I spent the little coin I had on a hatchet and went on my way. The randomly generated maps work like this. Each cardinal direction contains 9 dungeons, each filled with enemies that increase in difficulty the farther you go. Whenever faced with an enemy, I would just spam the attack button and make sure my health didn't get too low. By the way, those other 2 bars, the middle one's magicka and the bottom one's stamina. You'd think that'd be confusing, but I never used magic. Here in Dawnstar, you have to commit to a playstyle. For example, I committed to axes, so that's what I exclusively focused on finding upgrades for. I didn't bother with any other weapons or magic at all because it requires you to train skills and find the corresponding scrolls, and I didn't want to deal with any of that. The only difference really between magic and weapons is this tiny animation. When you get too injured, you can either hit one of those pink dots and warp back to Eustasia, use a warp crystal to do the same thing, or just walk away, rest, and return. If you die completely, which I did a fair amount in the beginning, your inventory is cleared minus what you have equipped. Early on in my playthrough, I was struggling. After every death, I would stupidly backtrack instead of reloading a save. I failed to use my aid points to ask the champs questions. I didn't know how to buy or sell, and I sucked at combat. Yeah, all you have to do is tap a button, but I was a noob at the time and did not understand the enemy scaling. Eventually, I learned to load instead of backtrack, ask questions instead of train skills, sell my crap to buy better crap, and finally, if within an unwinnable fight, just walk away, rest a bit, and then return to finish off the enemy. While continuing to make my way through the dungeons, still not knowing 100% what to do, I received my first ailment, specifically the blindness ailment, which removes your minimap, aka the only tool you have to know where you're at. Around the same time, my inventory was completely full, so I ditched a bunch of stuff, including a gift item that I should have held on to. Trust me when I say I probably spent a third of my time playing Dawnstar dealing with a full inventory. It's probably the game's most annoying quality. Accidentally picking up your old stuff just to load your inventory back up was a common occurrence. While killing, your inventory gets filled with so many useless magic items, with the only ones worth keeping being health potions and ailment curing ointments. I later realized if you don't have an ointment, then you can just rest off an ailment. At the 2.5 hour mark, the ice caves were driving me crazy, so I decided screw it. I'm playing with the map up. Using that strategy, I was able to navigate to some of the farthest dungeons where I faced new enemies and caught a case of vampirism, an ailment that drains health unless you keep killing. Once cured, I realized I need to focus more attention on finding these champs and completing the objective. Step 1 was to upgrade armor. Step 2, interrogate Chung harder for answers. Step 3, track down Delacroix, give him gifts, and receive clues. And Step 4, level up my personality to receive more aid points. During my grind, I even ran into the Gehenna himself because the game penalizes you for resting too much in high level areas. After dumping my inventory 20 more times, killing a ridiculous amount of drunk trolls, and finally talking to the 2 remaining champions, I physically made note of all my findings and tried to determine who the guilty person was. This investigation element of the game is genuinely fun and surprisingly difficult. Before picking who I thought the traitor to be, I was nervous because an incorrect decision causes you to essentially lose the game. You might be thinking, just look up the answer. Well, that's not possible. The traitor is random every playthrough. Right before I was about to choose, the game crashed. But I loaded it back up and chose Beatrice as the traitor. Was I correct? Hell no. It was Olivara. Luckily for me, I could load my save file back and choose the correct traitor, allowing me the chance to face Mr. Thriceborn once more. First, I had to deal with a bunch of his minions storming the camp, but eventually he reappeared and made his move. Not gonna lie, died a few times, but because of the special item given to me from the governor, I was able to defeat the Gehenna and receive the end credits. You know, overall, Dawnstar is a pretty good game. Ignoring the graphical shortcomings and non-stop need to manage your inventory, it's a pretty technically impressive game that features a fun objective, contains some awesome sprite art, and has just enough lore to be interesting. So consider me a fan. Will that be the case for Stormhold? Let's find out. For this playthrough, I decided I'd go as a knight, as it is the only other class to start with the highest health. The story this time around takes place in a prison located in the city of Stormhold, where you as the prisoner have to search the dungeons surrounding the prison camp in order to level up enough to unlock every area of the prison. Once enough areas get unlocked, you'll have the opportunity to face the evil prison warden endgame boss Quintus Varus. Sources vary on how exactly you're supposed to unlock every area, so just focus on leveling up your character, upgrading your gear, and finding all the needed quest items, and eventually you'll get informed on area unlocks. Since the objective this time didn't require me to go around asking a bunch of questions, I decided to put all my aid points this time into boosting my blunt weapon level, as it was my class's special skill. Early on in my playthrough, I noticed how the map was missing a blue dot, which happened to be the game's most important character, Helga. When I went to go check to see if she was there, my game crashed. But I didn't think much of it and just carried on. Visually, Stormhold is nearly identical to Dawnstar, except the map this time is exclusively brick, not icy blue. We also get a new batch of enemies here, all of which have interesting appearance and name iterations. Early on, I was completely confused on how to unlock areas of the map, so I was just walking around mindlessly, killing whoever was in front of me in hopes something would happen. Again, when trying to visit that missing character Helga, I was instead greeted by this, which I'm confident in saying is a glitch. Not knowing what to make of that, I went back to dungeon diving. Stormhold shares many of the same qualities and annoyances with Dawnstar. The inventory system still blows, the enemies are still highly finessable using the rest feature, the expanded map is still by far the best way to navigate, and magic is still more effort than it's worth. After failing to find Helga for now a third time, I decided I gotta restart the game and let's see if that helps. Yeah, that ended up being the move. Once I started a new game and recreated my character, Helga did reappear. Now that I was on a working save file, I was finally able to start grinding away at the objective. Here in Stormhold, there's no merchant NPCs, meaning no buying or selling, but that's not too surprising because this game did release before Dawnstar. Instead, all the NPCs just either train skills or exchange items. After playing Stormhold for about 2 hours, I was still yet to unlock anything, so I figured it'd be smart to pull up a location guide to reference in order to know how far I was going in the dungeons for unlocking and to make sure I wasn't going backwards. Thankfully that strategy worked and I received my first unlock announcement shortly after. I then decided to exchange all my gift items I accumulated in for aid points so I could just boost my blunt weapon to an overpowered degree. I even decided to murder a few NPCs to persuade my blunt guy Vander to keep the aid points coming, as that is an intended strategy here. Every so often I would come face to face with a new enemy, but they were never any problem. My only real problem was the stupid blindness ailment that I had to constantly rest off. Sometimes it was just more convenient to warp back to Helga and she'd heal me up, cause she can perform an ailment cure among other tasks. After successfully unlocking another map segment, I actually ran into the evil warden himself, signifying progress in the story. Now that I finally had a grip on how the unlocking process worked, the game became a more enjoyable experience. Enter new areas, fight new enemies, boost your stats, switch out your armor, exchange gift items, boost your stats, unlock new areas, down a few XP crystals, boost your stats. The game is insanely repetitive and predictable, but for being an Elder Scrolls flip phone game, it's pretty awesome. When faced against Varus for a second time, I knew the endgame boss battle was imminent. In order to prepare, I leveled up my heavy armor stat and had Helga enchant my ebony warhammer, which is actually the best weapon in my class. It wouldn't be long until I finally received the message I was waiting for, the final area unlock. Varus was said to be in the XX, which I can only assume means the priest hole, which is a real location in the game. He actually ended up being in a location aptly named Varus Victory, though he would have no victory as I delivered him a quick and easy L, allowing me to snag his coveted storm crystal and end the game. Despite how frustrating and flawed these Elder Scrolls Travels flip phone games are, they have a ton of charm. I really came around to enjoying them at the end of each playthrough. Dawnstar and Stormhold collectively took me around 8 hours to beat, but I bet you could slim that down to a clean 20 minutes a pop because these are essentially just menu navigation simulators. The next game we have to look at is another Travels title, but one that improves on the mobile formula in about every way imaginable. Released right after Dawnstar, right in between Morrowind and Oblivion, came our next title, Shadowkey from 2004. Like I said, we have ourselves another Travels title, except this time, look at what we're dealing with visually. I don't know about you, but I consider that a massive upgrade. Virtual Studios is again responsible for bringing us another mobile phone experience, but not just for any mobile phone. We're talking the Nokia N-Gage. If you aren't aware, the N-Gage was a phone/gaming handheld from the early 2000s that had many exclusive games made for it, many of which are surprising given the platform. I have actually played a real N-Gage before, and what I remember most about it is its incredibly convoluted control scheme. For Shadowkey, I decided to emulate it using the only recently available emulator that was a pain to figure out. After spending hours attempting to get the emulator to work and just eventually skipping a ton of steps entirely, somehow Shadowkey ran and I decided, fuck it, I'm mapping everything to a controller. And let me tell you, that is the move. I'll say it right away, this is a great game. Spoiler alert, maybe my favorite spinoff. On paper, when you consider playing Elder Scrolls on this device, you'd think no way that could be good, but you're wrong. Shadowkey is kind of amazing. The graphics, the controls, the art direction, Shadowkey really nails it. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, let me bring you back to when I first started. To switch it up, I decided Nord would be the race I'd go with this time around. A few things you'll notice right away is there aren't any cutscenes here in Shadowkey, instead 2D art slides, which get the job done. All the music is exclusively taken from Morrowind, which again is no biggie because that soundtrack is filled with certified slappers, and you'll immediately notice the very short render distance. From what I've seen, that's what people harp on most when it comes to this game. If you ask me, it's totally passable. The game just has so many charming qualities, I'll give the view distance a pass. When it comes to the story/objective here in Shadowkey, you're tasked with gathering a set amount of what the game calls star teeth. These teeth are obtained by completing certain quest lines given to you by characters which are scattered around the game's surprisingly large open world. Once you gather the desired amount, you then use them to defeat the final endgame boss, the Umbra Keth. This set of objectives is only for the game's main quest, which is what I exclusively focused on. I say that because yes, this time there are side quests available, actually quite a few of them. The game's name comes from the items you find called Shadowkeys, which are used to unlock special areas. Upon starting my hunt for the Star Teeth, I already found myself in love with Shadowkey. Here we got a super useful map, infinite quick saves, buying and selling, easy to navigate menus, concise dialogue, regenerative health, buildings that don't require you to load in, overall just a lot of smart design decisions. Once I finished fawning over the game's many strong suits, I realized it's time to get this main quest going. The main questline doesn't really have a set amount of missions, it's more formatted like a non-linear checklist of objectives centered around finding all the teeth. Many of the teeth can be obtained through branching options. It gets complicated, just know that you need 7 in total to beat the final boss. There is a somewhat useful quest menu, but I was pretty lost the entire playthrough. Not to the extent of, say, Redguard, but with a little looking online, I managed to figure out where to go and who to talk to with somewhat ease. While perusing the first hideout, I experienced my first spin-off lockpicking experience, which here is just an RNG decision based on your chosen stats. Something else that surprised me was how labyrinthian these maps are. Just look at these layouts. If it wasn't for that helpful in-game map, this would be a goddamn nightmare to navigate. Thankfully, the 3D look they went with here makes it so you don't have to play off the minimap like with the flip phone games, but you can do that if you choose to. After fumbling around the map looking for the proper keys to unlock each area, I ran into the game's first boss battle, which couldn't be easier. From his body, I grabbed my first Shadowkey, which I then used to finish up my current objective. My next task was to clear out this cavern filled with rats, spiders, zombies, and these things called worm mouths, which I love the look of. I'm honestly a fan of most of the creature designs here in Shadowkey. They all have that old school Elder Scrolls fantasy vibe, but at the same time are kind of goofy. It wouldn't be long until I had my next Shadowkey, completed my quest, and was out exploring a new area of the map. Every so often you stumble into characters asking for help, and sometimes those mini quests are required and other times they aren't. This is again where a little online assistance is needed. I originally tried playing without a guide, but after getting my cheeks absolutely pumped at Broken Wing, I decided to let our friends over at the UESP show me the way. With a new weapon in hand, I finally found the sentient tree that would give me the first of many tooth recovery missions. You'll find out a lot of times with Shadowkey, the mission structures go like this. Yeah, I'll help you out, but can you help me with this first? That is the mission structure for I'd say about 90% of the game. Another thing you'll become very familiar with while playing is the hit or miss combat. A lot of people seem to have issue with the fighting here, with how a lot of your hits don't register, but it's really not that bad. I found it tricky, but nothing compared to the past. Overall, I'd consider Shadowkey on the easier side of Elder Scrolls titles. Just look at the pace at which I'm able to clear out these rooms and how my health is barely affected. Similar to the other Travels games, villains like this guy pop up occasionally to taunt you, but it's really meant to just be a quick teaser fight for the endgame battle. Finishing up the rest of that location's objective took a while, but once completed, I was gifted my first Startooth. At this point in the game, roughly 4 hours in, I was really enjoying my time. Shadowkey was just checking a lot of boxes for me. The objectives weren't too hard to figure out, the world was just open enough to not be daunting, and the enemies weren't overly frustrating to deal with. I wasn't even hyper-focused on completing only the main quests. I was taking missions from anyone offering them. I then remembered this is only game number 5 out of 10, so I better focus up and find some teeth. The hunt for tooth number 2 found me in a dark cave containing linear pathways filled with enemies. Using my newly acquired crossbow, I was able to take them out from afar. This area ended up being no problem at all, as Shadowkey has this insanely lofty jump that allowed me to hop from section to section. Combat was only getting easier because each level up I would exclusively pump my strength, which not only increased my health but also damage. Worth noting that a lot of the loot that you'll be finding in caves like these completely blows. Every so often you find a nice new weapon, but most of the time you're provided non-essential items. A lot of what's found is useful if you're a magic wielder, but like with most Elder Scrolls games, I'm no wizard. My time in the cave ended up yielding 0 teeth, so I shifted my efforts to another possible dental destination. While pillaging my way through another linear locale, I ran into an item labeled Skyrim Potion, which had me thinking, where does this game take place? Fun fact, this game actually partially takes place in Skyrim, as well as Hammerfell and High Rock, which I thought was pretty awesome. This area in particular had some pretty repetitive portions. Regardless, I was still having a good time. I didn't even expect the game to be half as good as it was. One bit of criticism I do have for the game is how overly complicated some of these locations are. I eventually find where I need to go, but it takes a lot of wall scanning and map checking. With enough trial and error, I finally found the necessary character, took him out with ease, and received my second Startooth alongside a Daedric Axe. Sadly though, weapons don't have unique skins and are represented instead by basic looking placeholders. After facing this tricky to find MF for a second time and concluding some side quests, I was then informed on where to continue my tooth travels. This information came from that same Shadow Mage I saved in that fruitless cave. For my efforts there, he decided to give me another one of the coveted teeth, so it turns out my time there wasn't a waste. As per his instruction, I returned to Broken Wing, where this time I was actually able to defend myself now that I had the combat down. This back and forth fighting style I was using ended up working just fine for about every enemy. Up to this point, Shadowkey's maps have been complicated, but this one was almost maze-like. Trying to determine where to go in this black fog and trying to figure out who's a good character versus a bad one was a constant toss-up. Because of how easy every fight now was, I figured it would be pointless to keep boosting my strength when other stats could be more helpful. Like luck, for example, which affects your lockpicking. That could be beneficial because you do a lot of that here. I eventually discovered you can bypass most doors and chests by just spamming the lockpicking menu. The rest of the mission took some patience, but eventually resulted in the acquisition of another tooth, officially bringing me over the halfway mark. Believe it or not, it was at this point when I realized I haven't been putting on any armor. You'd think I'd remedy that and throw on a set, but I must have got sidetracked because I kept playing completely naked. The next area I found myself in, Dawnstar, has maybe the most insane map layout in the entire Elder Scrolls series. Just look at this and tell me it's not intimidating. As you can imagine, clearing this area out and completing the objective was no simple task. During my lengthy search through the city, I was picking up and handing out hundreds of items. I took part in a small arena fight, joined a few guilds, ran into this neat statue, met an NPC named Trent. A lot of wholesome Elder Scrolls moments occurred. I found it funny whenever I was hit with that goddamn blindness ailment again because it's not like I could see well anyway. Because of the city's insane double map size, it would be a while until I was able to complete all the needed quests to earn my 5th tooth, leaving me with only 2 to go. Despite the game's significant repetition, I was still enjoying my time playing. I kept thinking this is exactly how a mobile Elder Scrolls should be. If I was to downport a game like Morrowind or Skyrim to a phone, this is how I would do it. The objectives strike this perfect balance of complexity and depth that doesn't really require a guide. I'm just a person who, when they play games, I don't like to activate my brain too much. In order to wrap up finding the remaining star teeth, I first needed to clear out this cavern, which took really no time at all. Bit tricky to navigate, but overall the enemies were a cakewalk. After then earning my 6th tooth, I made my way to Glacier Crawl to complete the set. This part of the game was a real highlight. In order to complete the objective, you're required to go around this icy maze searching for keys, all while dealing with all sorts of neat looking enemies. By using the keys and matching them with the corresponding door symbols, you eventually unlock where you need to go. Originally, I thought this maze was going to be a little difficult, but it's really not that bad as the game gives you a lot of keys. Out of nowhere, I stumbled into the 7th and final star tooth, to which after NPCs started giving me all sorts of things to prepare for the final fight, when all I was thinking was this is just going to be like every other boss fight. Land a couple hits and down they go. Whether that was true or not was yet to be seen, so I headed over to the final location and locked in. If I had to fault Shadowkey for one thing other than the map complexity, it would be that the combat is almost too easy. These enemies are just posing no threat. Remember, I'm playing on an emulator with an Xbox controller, so my opinion isn't really worth much. I can almost guarantee using the original N-Gage keyboard would be hell comparatively. In classic Shadowkey fashion, I was lost in the map's convoluted layout, but I knew I was at least getting close when I stumbled into this familiar face for now a 3rd and final time. I eventually found myself on the ground floor where I was finally able to come face to face with the Umbra Keth in all his derpy glory. As expected, he went down super easy. At least that's what I thought at first. Turns out you actually have to backtrack the map with him following you, and then the Star Teeth help you officially finish him off. This task was actually quite difficult. When he swings at you, it does sizable damage. By abusing the quick save feature and non-stop gulping down the health potions I had in reserve, I was able to make it to the vault, where I placed the teeth in position and buckled down for the epic final fight. Despite that wet fart of an ending, I really only have positive thoughts for Shadowkey. It's a low stress, smooth running, surprisingly deep, bite-sized Elder Scrolls game that I really think could have been bigger if it wasn't released on such an obscure console. If you decide to play the game on a real N-Gage, you can actually take part in some multiplayer via Bluetooth. You and up to 3 other friends can link up and actually complete the storyline together, which, how cool is that? After spending 10 hours in Shadowkey, I can confidently say it's my favorite spin-off up to this point, at least in the Travel series. The thing is though, that little sub-series isn't finished. What if I was to tell you there exists one more, and it may or may not be a port of a mainline title?